So Mrs. H psychology. This is specifically for AQA psychology, but it would cover other specifications too. For AQA would be on our paper 2, which is approaches, and we're looking here at the psychodynamic approach, specifically the evaluation part. So if you search for Mrs. H psychology, you'll find two other psychodynamic part 1 and part 2, which deal with the key assumptions and explaining those. This is going on to the evaluation part 3. So if I bring up the evaluative points, I'm going to split it into positive and negative points, strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so we're talking here about the approach in general. So if I just talk through some of these key evaluations, and obviously in terms of your levels, if you're asked to discuss the psychoanalytic approach, most likely these days you're going to need to compare it. And we'll have a separate video on exam techniques on how to answer the questions, but these are just what you would need to include. So we have a look at the positive points first, the strengths. So Freud's work obviously influenced lots of people. If we start off with the fact that he helped to explain how childhood is really important for who we become as an adult, and that particularly traumatic experiences will go on to affect later adult life. So he was really instrumental in showing that childhood and whatever experiences you have in childhood will actually influence your later personality. Secondly, we can start off with a practical application. Obviously, his psychoanalytic therapy influenced influenced the worlds of therapy and psychiatry, and Freud helped us to see mental disorders as the result of some sort of painful experience. His psychoanalysis was developed as a method of treatment, and obviously there's plenty of evidence to show that his patients made full recovery, although obviously you would want to bring in one of the counterpoints, which is further down. We could then go on to things like Freud's assumption that part of the human mind operates on an unconscious level, but that unconscious still affects our behaviour. That's very widely accepted today. Most people have some acceptance of the fact that things might be happening in the unconscious that we're not aware of, but they are affecting our behaviour. So that's generally accepted. Freud's theory influenced many other psychologists, and we could include people like John Bowlby, his work on maternal deprivation. So Bowlby's understanding that there's a critical period that came from the idea of Freud's psychosexual stages, and that childhood is so important in who we become as an adult. We've also got others like Piaget and Kohlberg and stage theories, moral development, gender development, and so on and so forth. So there are various areas that you could include. So those are our strengths. Those are just a few strengths that you could include. If we want to talk about the criticisms, and of course it's important that we have a balance, so it is really key that we include some positive points, some strengths, as well as the negatives. There are a number of criticisms. Okay, so we'll start off with his biased sample. So his sample was mainly Viennese middle-aged women. We could say that it's really not a cross-section of society. They're not representative of everybody, and obviously whenever you have a situation like that, we say we can't generalize from his clients, his patients who already had neuroses, and that's why they were going to see him. So they weren't a cross-section of society. We can't generalize to the whole population. We can criticize the lack of reliability. They're from a small sample, and so on and so forth. Another key problem is that he worked with one child, and yet he came up with a theory of child development based on this one child. And we know this is incredibly unscientific. For a start, it's a small sample, got problems with replication, which we've already mentioned. But also there'll be other problems further down about lacking objectivity. But also he spent very little time with this one child as well, so there's various problems with that. We could develop the problem, or develop the point, that he is relying on his patients' recall. So they were telling him things retrospectively about their childhood, and obviously they're relying on their memories, and their memories may not have been accurate, and obviously that would question the validity of his research. He did not attempt to check the reliability of their statements in any form. And obviously, in order to be scientific, we need to make sure we have reliability. We need to make sure we've got validity, and using scientific methods, which I'm going to come on to. Freud used case studies, and although we do get a lovely, rich lot of information, we get qualitative data from a case study, they are very subjective. They could be explained in a completely different way by somebody else. So they are not capable of being replicated. Then they don't use scientific methods. For example, they don't state a hypothesis, which they go on to test objectively using empirical methods. And that is a requirement of a scientific approach. Another thing you could use as an example is things like concepts like Oedipus, Electra can't be operationalized. Those are concepts that are occurring in the unconscious. We can't operationalize them, and that's another key area to make sure our research is objective. It's a requirement of science, and obviously all of his work therefore lacks scientific credibility. Linking to point 2 above in the positive points, some argue that people recovering from psychotherapy have just experienced spontaneous recovery over time, I should say, rather than recovered from the therapy itself. So, for example, Eysenck's meta-analysis found 66% recovered after psychoanalysis, which all sounds very good, but so did 70% of patients with neurotic disorders who didn't even have any therapy. So, it could literally be spontaneous recovery, just time, healing and helping, as opposed to psychoanalysis. Finally, here, it's also criticized as being a very negative approach, because Freud says human behavior is driven by id, and we know that id in the unconscious is very destructive, it's very nasty, part of us is a very demanding part. And if we contrast to the humanists believe that we're born with this wonderful innate desire to fulfill our potential, to self-actualize, which is seen as a very positive approach of humanity as opposed to Freud's negative. I'm going to raise this a little bit higher so you can have a look at some extension work. This is very much extension work, so it is really only if you're aiming for very top grades, and to be honest, you would need to condense it as well because you want to get the other points in. But there are claims to support Freud. You've got some little bit of correlational research here, but we know there are problems with correlations, etc. And we've got another point about, in general, about it being a very chauvinistic, male-dominated view. Because remember, Freud was working in Victorian times, and we've got one of his points was that females were not able to moralize because they didn't have such a fear of castration and didn't identify as strongly, and obviously there's plenty of research to counter that. So that is a very brief run through of some evaluation points. There'll be plenty of others that you could discuss, but those will be some that my students will be working with. And then I have past exam questions that I can just flick through there, and obviously some key contributions as well that we'll work with our exam questions. Okay, so there's some exam questions there, but I will do a separate video on how to answer those.